Welcome everybody to the first CERC seminar. We're the Southeast Asia Research Center. For those of you who are at our first, the first ever CERC seminar, we have a number of seminars coming up, and we also have a brochure that is outside.
Yeah, and also some of them.
Some of you already have the brochures, so our propaganda machinery is already cranked up. I encourage you to attend some of our other seminars. If I may be allowed to mention them briefly, we have one coming up on the 7th of next month, Forgery and Formalism in Early Capitalist Bangkok. That's Dr. Simpson Lim of the Singapore University of Technology and Design. We have a discussion on the 14th, the following week, on the effects of returnee overseas Filipino workers in Philippine society. That's Dr. Yu Xiaojung of Hong Kong BU. And then just one other talk I'll mention the following month in October on the 19th, a talk by Dr. Michael Nelson, who will be well known to many of you interested in Thailand, about Thailand's 2015 draft constitutional charter, abusive constitutional making by an authoritarian regime, or so Dr. Nelson's take on this. However, today we're very pleased to have a distinguished scholar visit us. In fact, he's just arrived in the nick of time. It's only thanks to Hong Kong efficiency that Ben is with us at, as promised, at 5:30. Professor Benjamin Reilly is Dean of the Sir Walter Murdoch School of Public Policy and International Affairs at Murdoch University in Perth, which is a very beautiful city, they tell me.
It is. You have to come.
It's a bit far.
Come and visit.
I'd love to.
It's nothing to it.
He's a political scientist specializing in democratization, comparative politics, and political development. And he's the former professor of political science, head of policy, the governance program, and director of the Center for Democratic Institutions. See, it takes a while to introduce that. You've got a long resume here. In the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, NU. He's also worked for the Australian government, the United Nations, and other international organizations, holding appointments at Harvard, Oxford, and Johns Hopkins universities, the author or the editor of a number of books and many, many scholarly papers and articles, and the recipient of a number of prestigious grants. That said, Ben is also a friend of many of us here, and thanks again for coming, and we look forward to your talk. As for those of you here for the first time, after the talk there'll be time for a discussion of this interesting and not uncontroversial talk here.
Great.
Ben, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for coming here tonight on a Monday evening. I normally work on rather dry, dull subjects, electoral systems, political institutions, sort of micro-level analysis. But I've been wanting to kind of break out for a while. So this paper and the presentation today is kind of at the other extreme. Normally, political scientists do careful, incremental sort of work, and this is an attempt to be very speculative and deliberately provocative and look at the big picture. So I'm very conscious of the fact that I will be talking on subjects that I sometimes maybe I'm not as expert on as I should be, but that's what happens when you try and do something big and provocative. So the paper today is really comes out of several years of work that I was doing at Johns Hopkins University SAIS in Washington, D.C. has a Southeast Asia Studies program, and I was teaching there for a couple of years. And while I was there, I was the more I taught Southeast Asia in Washington and engaging with the American political science community, which is, of course, is extremely rigorous and huge and well-developed community, the more troubled I became by the disjuncture between what was going on in Southeast Asia and what very basic political science theory was saying should be happening. And a lot of the theories didn't quite seem to explain the reality. So this paper is an attempt to grapple with my increasing unhappiness with the world of political science theory, and to suggest some alternative explanations that maybe political science wasn't doing the job on. Starting point is my long-standing interest in questions of democracy and democratization. And Hong Kong is a perfect place to be having a discussion about democracy, of course, and the world has been watching the students of Hong Kong over the last year or two with great admiration. So, as you all know, probably better than my students in Australia know, democracy is a big, difficult, contested issue. But for scholarly purposes, the whole meaning of democracy often has to get boiled down to something much simpler and more comprehensible. Because democracy can mean lots of things to different people. It can mean freedom, it can mean a good society, it can mean human rights, it can mean elections, it can mean all sorts of different things. So scholars needing to have analytical precision often end up saying, well, we know democracy is this very big, broad, contested idea, but we need to boil it down into something that we can kind of measure and analyse easily. So scholars often end up looking at basic questions of elections and civil liberties and talk about liberal democracies and electoral democracies. And you've also got organisations that attempt to measure democracy. Freedom House is one fairly well-known one, an American think tank that does an annual survey of freedom in the world. And freedom in Southeast Asia, at least, has been, or democracy, has been pretty constant now for a while. You've essentially got three what we might call basic electoral democracies, countries where you can clearly choose and change your government through elections without being shot, without having some judicial process to bankrupt you in the defamation courts, without the country descending into civil war. Those three countries are the free countries listed there: Indonesia, the Philippines and East Timor. You've also, for many years now, had a group of what Freedom House likes to call partly free countries, what political scientists call semi-democracies or quasi-democracies. Singapore and Malaysia are the two best-known examples of this. We could also think of Thailand, just because it's really not clear where Thailand is going. You know, at the moment you would call it an autocracy, a military dictatorship, but you don't have to go too many years ago. It was the most promising democracy in Southeast Asia, and who knows what the future brings. And then you've got a whole array of different regime types amongst the clearly non-democratic countries. You've got an absolute monarchy in Brunei. You've got the interesting transition currently taking place in Myanmar, which may yet lead to something resembling an electoral democracy, but at the moment I don't think could qualify as that. Dominant single-party autocracy in Cambodia, again very long-lasting. And in Laos and Vietnam, the two Southeast Asian states that probably most closely approximate the kind of Chinese Leninist model of at least nominally communist one-party state. So you've got this real array of regime types, and at first glance it's hard to make sense of why we have all these different kinds of regimes. Here's a way of starting to make sense of the regime structure we get across not just Southeast Asia, but across East Asia. The blue countries on this in this map are what Freedom House considered to be electoral democracies, right? And the grey ones are the non-democracies. So that's an even more stark distinction than the one I just gave you between free and partly free and unfree. This is as basic as it gets. Can you change a government? Is essentially what Freedom House asks. Can you change your government at elections? If so, you're an electoral democracy. Doesn't matter whether you can do anything else. So countries like my old friend Papua New Guinea, which is a failed state on all sorts of measures, but is a functioning democracy. It's not a functioning state, but it's a functioning democracy. Meets the threshold, whereas extremely highly effective states which deliver all sorts of good governance outcomes, such as Singapore, for example, do not make the cut. do not make the cut because, as of today, it's still not really possible to change government in Singapore. That might be changing. Now, the reason I put this map up is because it highlights another issue when we look at East Asia, which is the extent to which electoral democracy is a maritime phenomena. You know, if we have a very stark geographical way of looking at East Asia, essentially you can almost work out who's going to be a democracy or not by just asking, are they on the, you know, we're talking about mainland or island Asia. If it's island Asia, they're probably a democracy. If it's mainland, they're probably not. And you've got the Singapores and the Malaysias of this world who are sort of in between. They're in between geographically, but they're also in between in regime type. So this is, you know, I thought that, well, this is kind of interesting. Maybe this is just accident. You know, there's all sorts of historical reasons for this. We can go back to the Second World War. We can talk about the US, the influence of the United States, the alliance system, and so on. But there's another puzzle when it comes to democracy in Southeast Asia. And this is the puzzle I was alluding to earlier, which is that the political science literature really doesn't help us very much. Most of basic political science modernization theory says that as you get wealthier, as countries get richer, and societies become more complex and more variegated, you typically get middle classes making more and more demands on the state, and over time, economic modernization tends to go hand in hand with political modernization. You know, that's why most of the rich countries in the world, outside the states that just rely on oil, pretty much all the other really rich countries, except in Southeast Asia, are democracies. Right? So this is one of the most basic kind of theoretical ideas in political science. It doesn't mean that it's true, but it's a kind of foundation stone. And if we look at the experience of countries like Korea and Taiwan, they're pretty good examples of this theory actually playing out in action. You know, these were countries that were poor, became rich. As part of getting rich, opposition movements became more and more outspoken, and in both countries the regimes ended up sort of allowing the opposition to contest elections, and eventually the countries made a transition into what is now recognised in both of those cases as, you know, pretty consolidated democracies. Where does this leave us in Southeast Asia? Southeast Asia goes the opposite direction. Let's go back to those countries that I was talking about. Indonesia, the Philippines, and East Timor. What can we say about those three countries? Well, they're all poor, relatively. They've all got lots of difficult social issues. None of them have achieved the kinds of modernisation that we've seen in other parts of Asia, or indeed in other parts of Southeast Asia. Indonesia, of course, is, you know, the largest Muslim country, largest Muslim democracy, and there have been numerous arguments put forward over the years that the difficulty in separating church and state under Islam tends to make Islamic countries, you know, tends to make democracy particularly difficult in Islamic countries. So you would have thought, well, the biggest Islamic country of all might have been difficult. Very deep ethnic and cultural divisions in all of those countries, and very high levels of poverty as well. And yet they understand our democracies. What are the non-democracies? I've already mentioned Singapore, which Larry Diamond, who's sort of Mr. Democracy in the United States, has rather colourfully phrased as the richest country in the history of the world never to be a democracy. But you've also got the Bruneis and indeed the Malaysias and others. All of those countries, particularly Singapore, but not just Singapore. Malaysia several years ago passed the threshold in terms of per capita income that political scientists say should be the threshold to make a transition to democratisation. It's still struggling to do it. So on the one hand, we have countries that really shouldn't be democracies are democracies, and on the other hand, those countries that political science says should have democratized by now haven't done it. So, just a quick recap. You can run through a whole bunch of. I won't bore you with it today, but if you are interested, you can go to the library and find literature on the difficulty of democracy in highly diverse, ethnically and religiously diverse societies. You can talk about how countries that had British colonial experience should have more luck with democracy than those with other kinds. You can look at the difficulties of Islam and democracy, and of course you can look at the whole literature on modernization, wealth, and human development. And none of them work in Southeast Asia. They work in most other parts of the world. They even work pretty well in most other parts of Asia, but they don't work in Southeast Asia. So I started thinking, went back to that map again. Well, what might explain this strange pattern, or this, at least, from a political science perspective, pattern of democracy versus non-democracy, given that clearly political science theory isn't? Well, here's one, and as I said, this is going to get a little bit wacky. Here's one way I thought, well, let's see, let's just have a look at a measure of distance, right? This is geographical distance, but I'm going to give you a more developed theory. But let's just start with geographical distance. There have been some very prominent scholarly articles that had looked at the fate of the post-communist world and had essentially argued that it all came down to how close you were to Brussels. If you were one of those countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism, that was geographically close to the West, in all that Eastern and Central Europe that had previously been under Soviet occupation, you were more likely to democratize. The further away you got, you became less and less likely to democratize. Once you got to Central Asia and so on, your chances were slim. And people fed this into regression analyses and said, look, this distance from Brussels, that's all you need. You don't need any other theory. So I thought, what about distance from Beijing? Maybe we'll just stick that into a regression analysis. I don't do statistical work, but let's stick this into a regression analysis and let's just see if there's any correlation, given that nothing else is working. So students, do not do this, okay? Don't do this. But, so stick these numbers into regression analysis, and you get this correlation, if you believe in this stuff, between a Freedom House score and this distance measure of saying, over a third of the variation in democracy in Southeast Asia on these numbers, you could say is explained by distance from Beijing. And indeed, there's probably, that probably understates the closeness in terms, the Philippines down there, is not that far from Beijing in miles, but it's a long way in other ways. Singapore, further away but closer, and so on. So there's at least, I think, something to be said for looking at the spatial relationship between democracy across Southeast Asia in terms of the connection to China. Now, I am not a China scholar, but part of this has sort of prompted me to try and learn a bit of Chinese history and go back into imperial history. I imagine most of you would actually know more about this subject than I would. But I have to say, once I started digging around, I thought, well, this is actually really interesting, because the more digging I did, the more it seemed like there were a bunch of factors, not geographical distance per se, but the proximity to China is connected to various patterns that we can, I think, elucidate. Many of them you can look back in history. The role of the tributary system, in the Ming Dynasty. You could look at Mao's support for communism in the border states around China, in the southern border states. You know, the fact that communist revolutions were supported to varying extents in places like Cambodia and Laos, Vietnam. Whereas the further you got from China, the much more difficult it became for communist parties. Communist parties were actually violently suppressed in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. So there's something going on there. Normative, ideational factors. There's a whole literature on autocratic thinking in Chinese political thought over the years. Arguments have been made that the one touchstone, the one common element of all the different regime types that China's has, it's never had a democracy. It's had warlord periods, it's had periods of imperial rule, it's had the communist period. It's never had democracy, and various scholars make arguments saying, well, there's actually a deep antipathy to some of the basic democratic ideas in Chinese thought. And you can even go into some of the patterns that we're seeing just today in terms of the way Chinese economic power is being projected into its near abroad, into the border states, and the different kind of effects being a southern border state in a Southeast Asian state that shares a border with China as compared to more distant states. So none of these things to me seemed explanations in themselves, but I did think it was worth a bit of a look. So let me quickly run through a couple of ideas, throw out a couple of ideas for you, and I'd really appreciate your own responses and thoughts to these, because as I said, this is deliberately just having, putting some ideas out there. There was a picture of the Great Wall when I started, right? There was no Great Wall. The Great Wall was in the north. There's no Great Wall in the south. Chinese history has been about gradual expansion over the centuries southwards. Neighbouring kingdoms, that weren't states in the period I'm talking about, I'm going back to the Ming Dynasty again, were gradually assimilated into the Chinese governance model. Again, the countries that are least democratic today, the Vietnams, the Laoses, Myanmar to some extent, parts of Thailand, were the ones that were most affected by the tributary sphere of influence. Modern day Indonesia, the Philippines, East Timor never came into it. Right? So there's a pretty clear distinction there. And in the paper I try and draw out mostly the work of other scholars who go into some detail about the kinds of patterns of the transmissions of ideas about authority and hierarchy and governance that came with being part of the Chinese tributary system. Right? And those ideas were transmitted predominantly, overwhelmingly, to the near abroad, what is today China's near abroad, much less to the maritime states. So maybe, I think this is at least a subject that's worth more investigation. I'd like to look into this more. Of course, we're talking several hundred years back. After the Second World War, I think it's better documented that the PRC did support communist revolutions. I know it's been claimed that China does not export revolution, but it did. And created, or certainly helped the creation of communist parties in Vietnam and Laos, and in rather different ways in Cambodia, and in a rather different way again in Myanmar too. We had Chinese support for communist revolutions, assistance to the Khmer Rouge. There was an attempt to create a like-minded Asian socialist community. Any of you ever heard of it? No, it didn't get very far. It didn't have a lot of appeal, but it was an attempt by China to create a kind of network of similar single-party, nominally communist political systems at the end of the Cold War. And there is quite a significant literature about Chinese nervousness about having a democratic state on its borders. I mean, one of the reasons that has been suggested for the ongoing Chinese support in North Korea, for example, is the real concern about a unified Korea, possibly democratic, possibly US aligned on its border. Similarly, what's going on in Myanmar today, I think there's considerable disquiet in Beijing about the possibility that Myanmar may indeed become a democracy, and even more disquiet about the idea that it might become a sort of more US-aligned democracy. I actually think that the Chinese have less to worry about there than maybe they think. And if you accept the argument in this paper, of course, that would be a good test case. If Myanmar becomes a thriving democracy later this year, then I think you'll say, well, that paper by that Australian guy, that didn't last long, because I think the chances of that happening are looking less and less likely all the time. So we have historical arguments about the transmission, essentially, of ideas about governance. We've got the post-war communist period of very direct attempts to, if not transplant, then assist communist revolutions. And again, that happened very differentially. The near abroad for China, it worked. The far abroad, if you were a communist in Indonesia, things didn't turn out too well. Same in Malaysia. Philippines is an interesting case, Mark. You'd probably have a better insight into that than me. I think they're still fighting, right? Officially. So, very differential history. Finally, there's what we're seeing today, which is, of course, a massive. I mean, China's important for everyone, for every country. Biggest trading partner for almost every country in this part of the world. But China's outward FDI flows are interesting because, again, they tend to predominate in the near abroad, and in recent years at least, there's been much less FDI flowing into the much bigger, in population terms, countries in island Southeast Asia. So here's an example: Indonesia, Philippines getting about a third or less of the investment than countries such as Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia and Laos, which is interesting in itself. What does all this mean? Well, I don't know. I think there's various ways of looking at this subject. One that comes up quite a lot is the idea that Chinese influence in mainland Southeast Asia is now so strong through all the kinds of infrastructure projects, telecommunications lines, gas lines, high-speed railways, road projects and so on, that once again there is going to inevitably be a strong transmission not just of Chinese goods and services and capital, but also some core ideas about governance. So some scholars, my friend Thitinan Pongsidarak in Thailand, for example, are now talking about the fact that there's a sort of a great game going on in mainland Southeast Asia, where countries like Thailand have become these sort of swing states. You know, Thailand is a US treaty ally, but increasingly close to China, and for good reasons. You know, that's where a lot of the investment's coming from, and it's at least appears to be the case that the regime in Beijing feel rather comfortable with the current regime in Bangkok. Of course, China's supported Cambodia very strongly through aid and investment flows over the years, and Cambodia has been supporting China pretty strongly in international fora in recent years. Vietnam's a bit of a problem for this argument because, of course, the Vietnamese are probably more concerned about balancing China than any other Southeast Asian state. But nonetheless, I'd say Vietnam, again, more than any other Southeast Asian state, has probably ingested over the centuries many Chinese ideas about governance and authority. So we're left with some interesting potential explanations for democracy in Southeast Asia, whereas the democracy and development connection doesn't work that well. Possibly democracy and China, or non-democracy and China, is a better explanation. Certainly, there are good theoretical reasons for thinking that their neighbourhood effects, the influence of a very large and influential country would be just as powerful, if not more so, in East Asia as it is in other parts of the world. I've mentioned the idea of the diffusion of norms, ideas of hierarchical, elite-centred governance, the lack of a democratic tradition in Sinitic culture. And, you know, there's also, of course, the reality that the US influence in Asia has been overwhelmingly in island Asia. I mean, the bases, the relationship with Japan, the relationship with Taiwan. So some scholars are actually saying that this division between autocracy and democracy in Southeast Asia is actually really much more about basic security interests than anything else. That essentially we're seeing a kind of, you know, autocratic Chinese, pro-China mainland and a more democratic US-aligned maritime sphere. I don't know. I'm just tossing all of these ideas around at the moment, and I wanted to toss them around with you and see what you thought of this. I've been talking for half an hour, so I'll finish up just by saying it seems to me that there is something going on here. And one of the implications might be, if you take any of this, you know, if you believe this, that the kinds of tensions that we've seen within ASEAN are probably likely to become more powerful, because if there's a sort of underlying and, as I would argue, deep-seated reasons why we're seeing differences in regime types, and that those differences are essentially reinforcing along a basic mainland maritime geographical divide and are actually becoming stronger rather than weaker, then maybe the whole issue of democracy is going to become a genuinely strategic issue. And if it does become a genuinely strategic issue in ASEAN, then ASEAN's got problems, because I think there's going to be a big division emerging there. But we'll see. That's just a little bit of speculation. All right, and I will end with that. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Ben, for that. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, comments. So, Ben, if you want to lead your own discussion here.
No.
I'm just judging, my question is by the abstract which was on the poster. And if I remember correctly, I don't have the text in front of me right now, but you suggested that there is a correlation between the degree of lack of democracy, degree of lack of democracy and economic development. If I understood it correctly, could you elaborate just a little bit? Because I think it's more or less, of course, there are a few cases which might be a little bit exceptional, such as the Philippines, but it's pretty persuasive that the distance from China may affect the what was the word? Lack of democracy.
Yeah.
You understand what I mean, but the economic development that goes along with it. I'm just curious.
Sure. So the typical pattern that we have seen in the theory is that economic development and political development tend to go hand in hand. If we're talking about Europe, for example, we're talking generally. And even in Asia, you can see plenty of examples of that. I mentioned, Korea and Taiwan, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't go hand in hand in Southeast Asia. So the correlation actually runs the other way. If you want to, I haven't done it here, but it's an easy thing to do. You can correlate the Freedom House democracy scores with the per capita GDP. I did it. There's no relationship at all. In fact, the relationship is negative in Southeast Asia. So in Southeast Asia, the richer you are, the less democratic you are, broadly speaking, because you've got this concentration of poorer countries that are now the more established democracies, but we haven't yet seen the countries such as Singapore or Malaysia make the transition away from this very controlled one-party dominant political systems that they've had all these years. And one of the ways that political scientists, one of the very limited ways that political scientists use to measure democracy is just saying, have you had a change of government? Can you have a change of government? If you can have a change of government through mass elections where there's contestation and participation, then according to Freedom House and a lot of other, you're a democracy. And that's what we have not yet had in the richer countries in Southeast Asia, but we have had it in the poorer countries. So that's the argument. Yeah.
Ben, if I can, maybe one thing that would help clarify, for me anyway, your argument is, you mentioned the case of Myanmar and how we have the election coming up, and also the Thai case. So how, in your view, does the causality work? If you look at the Thai case, clearly what's going on primarily is a domestic political struggle that has most recently resulted in a coup. It's actually the third coup in a decade, if you count the 2008 airport occupation coup. And so, it's primarily driven by this domestic fight between, pro-monarchy and pro-Thaksin elements. So, where does China figure into that argument? Clearly the military is looking for friends. It doesn't have many friends in the West anymore. In Myanmar, on the other hand, the government apparently got a bit nervous about being so close to China, a military government, but they were a little concerned that they were so dependent on China. And a lot of experts believe that what's going on is that Myanmar has opened up in part to increase its diplomatic options, and it got 2 Obama visits out of it anyway. So, where does your causality come in there? How do you, China is important, we know that, trade's important and so on, but is it just sort of, accepting changes or encouraging them, or how do you see the causality working?
Right, and that's very good questions, and some of this stuff I'm only kind of grasping at answers myself. I guess my answer would be, if you accept this sort of deep history argument that countries that had centuries of influence under imperial Chinese rule, under the tributary system, for example, that certain ideas about governance, certain basically highly autocratic ideas were transmitted as part of that history. If you buy that, then you can say, well, we would expect that to make democracy in these countries today more difficult. Right? It's not necessarily a strict causal. It's not a strict causal argument at all. It's just like that would be troublesome, because you'd have some ideas about egalitarianism or about mass participation that are maybe not widely held. Right? Now, in both of the cases you mentioned, democracy has been they've had democratic periods over the years. My argument, I guess, is that what we're seeing now is maybe a reversion to some of the patterns that were in place centuries ago, where the influence, Chinese influence, is making it more difficult for democracy to reappear than it otherwise would. So this would not pass muster at APSA, right? This is very speculative. You could similarly ask, and I have been asked, well, how do you explain Indonesia? And I give a sort of similarly wishy-washy answer. Well, Indonesia had a long, had those Suharto years, so that doesn't fit my model, or doesn't fit the argument. But the underlying argument would be it's easier in Indonesia for Indonesia to democratize today because some of those Semitic ideas about governance, and particularly the antipathy towards this idea of throwing out governments, mass participation elections, never really took hold. How you measure that, how you really get into that, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a bit of an outsider here. I'm not in political science, but in communication science. And your explanation about proximity fits in some of the communication discussions where one makes the argument that the closer a country is to the homeland, the more news you get from that country, and the further the distance, etc. So in that sense, I see some kind of interesting points raised. But in general, isn't your classification too formalistic to use as a comparative analysis type of model? Because what is democracy? You're using Freedom House categorizations, which are highly doubtful, I would say. And then if you go into the details, as Mark Thompson was asking, you have to admit that it's often determined and coming out of localized events. So my question is, what's the contribution political science is making here? Shouldn't we go to anthropology and study it from the inside out rather than from the top down?
Yes. Well, this paper came out of my frustration with political science, I guess, because as I said at the beginning, the theories didn't seem to be doing a very good job of explaining the present day reality. This is partly just an attempt to grapple with something that is clearly present. We all know that China is hugely influential, has been hugely influential over many centuries, millennia, and that it's again hugely influential today. And it's an attempt to grapple with that reality plus this strange unusual pattern of democracy that we see in Southeast Asia. It's certainly not the whole story, but I have to say the more I looked into it, the more it did seem to me that proximity or distance from China, not so much just in geographical terms, but in ideational terms, historical terms, did help to explain something. I think it does help to explain why you have such resilient single-party regimes in places like Laos. I think it helps to explain some aspects of governance in Cambodia, maybe Vietnam, and it's an attempt to look at an alternative explanation for democracy when our current theories really don't do a good job. They really don't. So yeah, I mean, you could say, look, everything is local. Let's look at the local picture, and I think there's a lot to be gained there. But when you step back, sometimes it's good to just step back and have a sort of bird's eye picture too. You tell me, why is democracy in East Asia, all in the maritime states? What? Maybe there is a better explanation than my one, but it's puzzling to me. It's a puzzling geographical distribution. Now you say freedom houses, they're no good. Well, if we are dealing with this rather limited definition of democracy, which is, do you have participation and contestation and can you change elections? Actually, I disagree. I think they're actually about right. I mean, those other countries broadly I would call democratic myself. I don't see that many mistakes there. Where are the are there democracies there that we've missed out? So this is, as I said, a very speculative exercise, but I don't think it's just a matter of saying let's look at the local conditions in every country, or if it is, we've ended up with a very unusual geographical distribution that to me still cries out for analysis. Maybe there's a better analysis, but I think it still cries out for analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I was just wondering, one possible route, given your interest in critique or taking on challenging modernisation theory, is to sort of look at guys who've been doing this for several decades who are actually at your home university. I mean, social conflict theorists have been doing this for a long time. They don't sort of overwhelmingly dwell on the local. They sort of, try and transcend scales and so forth. And they do have explanations for the particular outcomes in these scenarios that don't rely on the explanations that you've been providing. I'm just wondering where you stand on that, and why you haven't sort of integrated the social conflict theory analysis into your reading of what you're looking at here.
Yeah, well, I'm not persuaded, I guess, by the macro level applicability of those theories. Yeah, I think some of my colleagues would probably hate this for that very reason, because I just, it's not what I've been looking at. I've been looking at the literature on democratization and then this sort of political geography, essentially. But I would still need to be persuaded about why do you have such a marked geographical pattern, and I'm not aware that social conflict analysis or the oligarchy analysis sort of says something on that specific issue.
I'm not convinced on that, but anyway, but it doesn't hold for Northeast Asia, right? I mean, what about Peninsular Korea?
Right.
Do you just explain that with GDP, or is it?
Well, it's Northeast Asia, as I said, the theory, the basic theories do the job for us. But Southeast Asia doesn't.
I mean, where's the stuff about historical context, the role of powers like the US, in Indonesia supporting, the Suharto regime after guided democracy in Sukarno and so forth? I just don't see any of that here. To tell the story, I think, of both maritime Southeast Asia and beyond, you need to have that sort of that stuff factored in. Otherwise, you're coming down to a sort of very reductionist.
Yeah, sure. No. Well. I guess I would say that there is a confluence in US, or there has been historically, this confluence in US grand strategy between democracy and its strategic interests in Asia. It's helped the US enormously that Japan and Korea, Taiwan, we're dealing with democracies. There are a number of scholars who make similar
support for authoritarian regimes over long periods of time, right?
Right, but again, look at the pattern of where are the US bases in Asia today. As I said, Thailand's the swing state, and this is, I guess, the argument about, Thailand is a treaty ally that seems to be becoming increasingly close to China. Maybe, because I'm not putting up any of this as definitive, maybe, part of the answer is this, geographical proximity versus distance. And maybe, as I did say at the end, somewhere, maybe what we're looking at is a kind of new sort of security architecture in which democracy becomes much more infused with, US strategic interests. Certainly, I think the Australians would like to claim that. They think this is great, that there's a sort of offshore Asia security arrangement that essentially puts, Indonesia and the Philippines with Australia in terms of future US interests. I don't know. I'm not claiming any of this is more than speculative.
Bill? Yeah, Ben, do you think that China really needs to be so worried about the kinds of regimes with which it deals? Because, you look at democracies all across South America, Africa, and maybe even the United States, and China has no problem trading with them or investing in those places. I think, too, about, autocracy or authoritarian politics close to home. Does that necessarily make China more secure? There is no theory of authoritarian peace. as there is a theory of democratic peace. And so I look at some of the closest enemies, some of the worst enemies that probably China's had in the region: Soviet Union, North Korea is very uncertain, and Vietnam, of course, all authoritarian regimes, and yet have presented profound security threats to China.
Yeah.
So does it really matter? I mean, you seem to be saying that they're leveraging off this imperialist past and these kinds of norms, trying to make the most of it to encourage regime changes around the world. I'm not sure that's really true, but does it really need to do those things in order to interact with these other countries in the kinds of economic ways that it wants to?
Yeah, I'm actually not making that claim, Bill. I have seen that claim made, and I was actually just reading the Journal of Democracy on the plane on the way over, and there's an article in the current issue by a China scholar making that exact argument that, you know, China is sort of trying to spread autocracy in other countries, and it clearly internally at the moment it's also some of those, you know, those sort of nascent democratic reforms, village level elections, and some of the opening up of political space are clearly now closing down. Does that make the regime in Beijing today more comfortable in dealing with other autocracies in other parts of the world? There have been some studies. Most of them come out fairly, you know, maybe, but hard to see. I think certainly, you know, in Africa, China's interests are predominantly economic. They're not trying to spread a sort of Chinese model. But are they more comfortable, particularly in their near abroad, in their own backyard, with similarly autocratic governance systems versus, you know, wild and crazy democracies? I think the answer is probably yes. And they're certainly, I think, very concerned about the confluence between democracy and US, you know, US alignment. I think the idea of, as I think I mentioned, you know, a pro-US Myanmar right there, you know, after some period of democratization and flourishing of liberal institutions, would be deeply worrying to those in Beijing. However, the good news for them is that if you believe this, which is essentially this sort of China-centric view of, you know, history, Myanmar's chances of becoming this sort of Jeffersonian democracy are maybe a lot less than people in Washington think. You know? And I think that's probably true, actually. I would say, yeah, I think Myanmar's a lot, you know, less likely to become a, you know, flourishing democracy than a lot of people maybe, you know, in Europe and the United States would like to believe. Yeah. But none of this is deterministic. I think all these criticisms are dead right. I'm not disagreeing actually with any of them, because I'm still trying to work out if there's any there in all this.
Well, two actually. I think first of all, do you think it's even possible with that limited number of cases to ever come to a generalizable theory about democratization? Considering that actually we don't have that many countries in the whole world, yeah, which would be needed to have that kind of theory. And secondly, could it not be just coincidence what we're seeing here? I mean, of course, I think there are linkages, whatever, but may just be a coincidence, and we may not even find any sort of answer for this.
Yes, it could be a coincidence. Yeah. That's possible. The whole thing could just be accidental. That was sort of my starting point. I thought, well, this is interesting. You know, maybe this is just accidental, but, you know, when we look into it more, you know, maybe not. I'm not trying to put forward a generalizable theory of democracy, but I do think China's the relations with China's border states in Southeast Asia are different. You know, I think China's own backyard is viewed. Come on, we're in Hong Kong. I mean, I don't need to tell you guys this. Things are different. It's different. If it's further away, people in the rulers in Beijing are less concerned. If it's on particularly countries that are Chinese border states, you know, you can take this argument further. That's one of the reasons I put this up. One of if you want to be a democracy, don't be your Chinese border state. I mean, China's got 14 border states, and 2 of them are democracies, and that's Mongolia and India. Now maybe that is all accidental. Maybe this is just pure, this is, random, assortment. But I don't think so. And as I said, there's been much more detailed studies than this one conducted in other parts of the world that look at, democracy on Europe's border, the whole story of, the Western Hemisphere, that make similar arguments. So it's actually not, the argument that a very large and powerful, and in this case probably core state influences its neighbours is actually not a particularly breathtaking argument. It's I would say accepted wisdom. It just might not be accepted wisdom in Asia yet, until this paper takes off.
It's very interesting. As a Chinese, we have always been told that Singapore can be China's model, that you can liberalize the economy without democracy. And actually, during China's reform, we believe that Singapore has had huge influence on China with Deng Xiaoping's several visits. So I have a question about Singapore's influence instead of China in the region, or has Singapore influenced the region through China? And I think Singapore brings up another aspect of the distance, a very interesting concept, which is social distance with all these Chinese overseas communities. Maybe they're geographically further away, but I wonder, but because Indonesia also has a huge Chinese community, and but how come it has not like?
Right. Yeah, no, good question. Well, of course, as I understand it, the interest in Beijing in the Singapore model is precisely the way that Singapore has managed to have, a very free market and highly successful development, but without having free politics. With maintaining restrictions on politics, so that the same party stays in power. Right? I think that's probably putting it a bit crudely, but I think that's the core of the appeal. Singapore's a fantastic success case on most indicators, except political freedoms. Pretty much everything else, it looks great. Of course, it's a city-state too, so how transferable the Singapore model is to a huge country like China, I think is debatable. But it's precisely this combination of open markets and closed politics, and the fact that the Singaporeans seem to have found a way to make that work, that I think is appealing to those in Beijing. So to that extent, yeah, I mean that's I think that's the holy grail for for those in power in China today. They want to find a way of keeping the economic show on the road, but they clearly have even less interest than they had a decade ago in any liberalisation of the political system. So you're right that the influence goes both ways. But I mean, I think more generally the China model, when people talk about the China model, they're talking about rapid economic development, but without messy democratic politics. And that's, that model is of interest to many countries in many parts of the world. People may not be aware, but we are in the middle of a big kind of democratic retreat around the world. So we had a kind of a high point, about a decade or maybe 15 years ago, and many countries that were then fledgling democracies have now slipped back into some other regime type. So part of the answer that gets trotted out is the influence of China. It's only part of the answer. But it clearly is happening globally. There's been a marked reduction in the number of competitive democracies around the world.
Right.
Sometimes with general theory translation, and you've got some outliers which don't fit the model. Sometimes it's it's justifiable to look at the outlier, and if you can explain it away, it actually strengthens the theory. The big outlier in your model, if you treat Mongolia as an electoral democracy, is Mongolia, and it ticks all the boxes except the maritime box. And everything that you've said would lead us to believe that Mongolia should essentially mimic China politically. Do you have an explanation for Mongolia's exceptional achievement if it's actually a democracy?
That's a very good question. I think, I mean, I have spent some time in Mongolia. I think it was much less influenced by China than it was influenced by Soviet Russia, actually. Now, which of course isn't a promising starting point either. Certainly when I was there, a lot of the democratic opposition movement forces were being galvanized by actually concerns about the influence of China, concerns about the influence of Chinese mining interests, concerns about the really rapid economic development that was taking place mostly on the back of Chinese money. I don't know if Mongolia's, want to put too much faith in Mongolia as a democracy. It's had some ups and downs, but again, if you buy this argument, you would say, well, you know, it just didn't receive anything like the kinds of influence over the centuries from imperial China than, say, some of the countries that I've been focusing on. You know, you would put it in the same category as some of those more distant maritime countries. But I said, all this stuff is very speculative. You know, there's probably a Mongolia expert in the room who'll be able to give us a better answer. Or not.
So if we could just push Malaysia a couple hundred kilometers closer to Indonesia, might that tip this semi-democracy into an electoral democracy?
It's actually pretty close to Indonesia.
Yeah. Well, what do you think? I mean, this is, you know, Malaysia would fit very nicely in my argument if it was a democracy too. You know, it's this kind of in between, half-half.
Mahathir is doing his best.
Mahathir is doing his best.
We have in the region.
Yeah, I mean, Malaysia's a good example. I mean, to have modernized and yet not democratized is a, you know, you've written about this, so you know it's a puzzle.
It's not a puzzle, and I'm with these other guys too who say that it's the internal variables that they count most. It's very clear in Malaysia. Their problem is a communal one, and that has nothing to do really with mainland China. It's
sure, no, I'm not making any particular claim about mainland China in relation to Malaysia. It's Malaysia and Singapore are kind of semi-democracies, and they're at this you know, amphibious location on the map too. So the argument would work, but it's the puzzle for political science theory. And you know, Przeworski and those guys have all sort of run the numbers and said, you know, once you hit that, I think it's about $15,000 per capita per year, you know, you get a transition, and you get it in all these places, and you haven't got it in Malaysia. So, to that extent, it's a puzzle.
What we do have, however, was a very interesting discussion, and thanks again for your talk, Ben, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.